Let's put some of those issues to our guest to discuss this. Crystal Fleming, Associate Professor of Sociology at Stony Brook and author of the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. Crystal, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. How do you think Martin Luther King would look at the USA today with Donald Trump in the White House and his sympathies with white nationalists? And as we were hearing in our report, 277 black people shot and killed in 2018 so far by the police.
I mean, I think it's obvious that Martin Luther King Jr. would be absolutely appalled to have a president of the United States who was supported by KKK members and Nazis globally, a president who is himself an overt racist. I think it's obvious that Martin Luther King would be appalled by that. But I also think that Martin Luther King would not be surprised, you know, in a speech that's not as famous as it should be, but a speech he gave here in New York City in Harlem exactly a year to the day before he died. He not only denounced the Vietnam War, but he was very explicit in saying that a nation like the United States that spends more money year after year on warfare than it does on social programs is fast approaching spiritual death. Those are Martin Luther King's words, right? Decades ago, he saw that this country was approaching spiritual death. So I think that, you know, towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was not at all naive about the links between systemic racism and white supremacy on the one hand, as well as poverty, capitalism, and militarism on the other. And unfortunately, that radical vision that he came to embrace was certainly not shared by the vast majority of Americans in his lifetime, nor is it shared by the vast majority of U.S. citizens today.
As you're speaking to us, we're showing images of the famous speech in 1968, the I Have a Dream speech, which I listened to, as many of us in the office did before, earlier today, and obviously it's the most amazing piece of oratory that many of us have ever heard. But I wonder how it leaves you feeling as an academic, someone who works with young people, someone who helps to try and shape their futures.
I think it's an amazing speech, but I also think that Martin Luther King Jr. gave a number of other speeches that don't get enough attention. So I mentioned the speech on Vietnam in 1967, but also in 1957, he gave a speech called The Birth of a New Nation, and this was on the heels of his return from Ghana. Martin Luther King Jr. visited West Africa twice, the first time in 1957 to see the inauguration of Kwame Nkrumah. I mentioned this speech because in it, Martin Luther King Jr. expressed his support for independent movements throughout Africa. He made it clear that his vision of freedom was not limited to the United States. He opposed white supremacy here, but he also opposed colonial rule throughout the West, throughout the world. And so I think that, you know, as I reflect on the I Have a Dream speech, of course I continue to be inspired by that personally and also as an educator and a researcher. But as I also reflect on Martin Luther King's lesser-known speeches, right, his politics were far more radical than I think most people are aware of. And we need to be aware of that aspect of his vision because the moral revolution he called for at the end of his life, we still haven't seen it yet.
Crystal Fleming, I'm afraid we need to leave it there. We could go on a lot longer, I know, but thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your insight and your opinions. Thank you very much, Crystal Fleming there, Associate Professor of Sociology at Stony Brook and author of the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. Her views, her feelings on this 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King.